You're doing that because you know my boss is behind stage, right? Welcome everyone to the closing plenary. Day 2 of the plenary of the UNA USA Leadership Summit. I hope today has been a good one for you and you've learned a lot and become more informed about how the UN works for peace, people, and the planet, as well as feeling a little bit more empowered to get ready for tomorrow to make the case for the UN with your members of Congress. As you know, Congress and the administration play an important role in making decisions on how the U.S. provides support for the UN. So thank goodness we have Peter Yo, who's one of the people most responsible for making sure that Congress and the administration understand why it's in America's best interests to support the UN and its agencies. Peter is the president of the Better World Campaign and senior vice president for the UN Foundation. He joined UNF in 2009 after more than 20 years in senior roles at the State Department and on Capitol Hill. So he truly knows what it means to promote a strong US-UN relationship. Today, he will moderate our next discussion on moving forward together. Welcome, Peter.
How you doing? How are you? Well, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the introduction. Nice to see you all. Nice to see so many friends and longtime colleagues here. We are incredibly happy that you're in Washington this week, not only because the weather's awesome, but or are actively participating online, because both ways we can have an influence in terms of Capitol Hill. Because together, this type of engagement shows a real commitment to strengthening America's relationship with the UN by getting ourselves smarter, by educating our friends, our colleagues, and our neighbors, and most importantly, by advocating with the US Congress, including tomorrow during Lobby Day. UNA USA is the premier organization under the stellar leadership of Rachel Pittman and Farah Eck that makes this all happen. And you all, as members and supporters of UNA USA, are on the front lines of ensuring that the U.S. remains engaged at the United Nations at the highest levels and that we meet our obligations to the organization. So thanks to you. And as you know, under the Biden administration, we have collectively been able to achieve a lot on the UN and multilateral issues. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, check. Getting funds flowing again to UNFPA and UNRWA, check. Remain in WHO, check. Successfully run for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, check. Engaged with the UN and UN member states at the highest levels as partners, check. Pay our back dues to the UN regular budget, check. And propose funding to pay our back dues to UN peacekeeping, check. But of course, there's a lot more to do. And first and foremost, we must convince Congress to pay our more than $1 billion in back dues for UN peacekeeping. Second, it's important that the U.S. continue to pursue rejoining UNESCO, the UN's organization that promotes science and education and culture. Third, the U.S. must continue to push for reform and change at the UN to ensure that UN programs are managed as effectively as possible, that waste, fraud, and abuse is eliminated, and that taxpayer dollars are carefully stewarded. Fourth, the U.S. must push against initiatives at the UN that are promoted by other countries that do not share our basic commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And to make all of this happen, we're fortunate to have a top-notch Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, Ambassador Michelle Sisson, who is here with us today. As Assistant Secretary for I.O. at the State Department, Ambassador Sisson is playing a central role in all of these very weighty discussions. She's been traveling to Mali to learn about the UN peacekeeping mission there and to help craft U.S. policy related to the renewal of the mission. She's been lining up support for Doreen Bogdan-Martin, a highly talented American, to be the next head of the UN's International Telecommunications Union. She's been coordinating with the new head of UN Women on supporting Afghan women and girls, ringing the alarm bell about the food crisis being caused by the war in Ukraine, working to strengthen WHO, including sustainable financing, fighting for budget discipline and transparency throughout the UN system. And that's just within the last month. I can't believe it's an incredible agenda that she has set on behalf of the administration related to the UN and multilateral organizations. Luckily, with her long career in diplomacy, previously serving as U.S. ambassador to Haiti, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and the UAE, as well as former U.S. deputy representative to the UN from 2014 to 2018, we have an ambassador system, somebody who is extremely well versed on these issues, and no surprise, has already taken a high-profile role as Assistant Secretary and been incredibly welcomed in New York and here in Washington. So, Ambassador Assistant Michelle, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Rachel and Farah, and it's so good to see all of you in person and the folks who are joining virtually. Delighted to be here with you this afternoon. Now, the State Department, as you may know, has a long history of engagement with the UN Association, including developing and launching the Youth Observer Program 2 years ago. In fact, I understand that several Youth Observer alumni are participating in these UNA USA events this week, and that's just terrific. I know we've all been impressed by Cynthia Yu, the most recent of these excellent youth voices, by Cynthia's energy and by your energy, initiative, and new perspectives. We need these new perspectives and these fresh voices as we tackle the challenges, the global challenges that are facing all of us today in the multilateral space. Now, I think the theme that you all have chosen, moving forward together, is certainly very appropriate for this year's Leadership Summit. So let me start by recognizing your resilience, your commitment, and your determination. The challenges facing the world, of course, did not pause during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, in some ways, these challenges have become even more complex. And as Secretary Blinken recently said, quote, "We have to face them together. That's why we've put diplomacy back at the center of American foreign policy to help us realize the future that Americans and people around the world seek, one where technology is used to lift people up, not suppress them, where trade and commerce support workers, raise incomes, create opportunity, where universal human rights are respected, countries are secure from coercion and aggression, and people's ideas, goods, and capital move freely, and where nations can both forge their own paths and work together effectively in common cause," end quote. Now, the world needs active, positive American leadership on the global stage more now than ever. But sustaining such an effort requires energy and interest from the American people and from all of you. So happy you are going up virtually on that door knock tomorrow. One of my goals today is to hear from you in the session right after my remarks, where I hope that we'll be able to interact with the folks who are participating virtually and the folks who are here in the room. How can we more effectively communicate to communities across our country the benefits of U.S. investment and engagement in the UN and other multilateral bodies and encourage more Americans to become involved? What are the issues that you believe resonate with Americans most clearly? How can we more effectively involve the American public on our multilateral priorities and benefit from that collective perspective as we interact with other nations and with folks around the world? And again, your theme, the summit's theme this year, moving forward together, is a very apt way of describing multilateral diplomacy. Nothing at all happens at the UN without partnership and allyship among nations, without negotiation, without the sharing of perspectives, or without steadfast advocacy and persistence. And I've seen this throughout my 40 years with the State Department, whether in my current role as Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs, serving as a U.S. ambassador abroad, or as the Deputy Perm Rep up at the UN in New York. So we continue to move forward together with our partners to ensure that the UN is fit for purpose, advances global stability, operates with greater efficiency. And we know that people around the world see the UN as a key platform at which to address the big challenges facing all of us. So when crises have emerged, we've been ready. Now I'm going to speak in a moment about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But first, I want to highlight a few points from our May presidency of the UN Security Council in New York. Yes, there was definitely much focus on the effects of Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine. But we also used the Security Council platform, you may have noticed, to confront the food security crisis, which is impacting countries all around the world. We launched days of action across the UN system. Around the world, we are seeing the greatest global food security crisis of our time. It's a crisis that had been building for years, driven in part by accelerating climate crisis, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We made, as the United States, a $10 billion pledge at last September's UN Food Systems Summit in response to growing awareness that worsening food insecurity around the world was not just a threat to families and communities, but also to global stability. As background, between 2016 and 2021, the number of people living in acute food insecurity skyrocketed from 108 million people to 161 people around the world. And that, of course, was before the Russian Federation's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, which, according to the World Bank, is now may drive another 40 million people, in addition, into extreme poverty and food insecurity this year. Now, the U.S. has responded by announcing over $2.3 billion new money in new humanitarian assistance since Russia's invasion. But this nexus between food security and conflict affects all of us. It affects countries in the Middle East. It certainly affects many countries in Africa, really around the world. So we saw Secretary of State Blinken host a UN Security Council meeting in May to clearly define that link between conflict and food insecurity. He hosted a separate ministerial meeting in which he highlighted that every driver of food insecurity has been made worse by President Putin's war of choice. And at the ministerial meeting, the U.S. announced an additional $215 million in new aid to address food insecurity in many countries around the world. We also launched a roadmap to tackle the growing global food security crisis at that meeting. And as of today, we've seen 87 countries sign on to this roadmap. We also took the opportunity of our May presidency in New York to stand up humanitarian and disaster risk reduction focus in Geneva, where the U.S. and Kenya hosted and convened a roundtable discussion with international organizations, civil society, diplomatic missions to galvanize further action in the humanitarian space and in the disaster risk reduction space by these Geneva-based actors to address global food insecurity. At the same time, we had our colleagues at the U.S. mission to the Rome UN agencies work with the World Food Program WFP, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, to come together and rally private sector and donors to strengthen the response to the current food insecurity crisis. Back in New York, we saw the General Assembly adopt a resolution calling on the international community to support the countries most affected by this food insecurity crisis. The highlight, of course, and the key to this, of course, is going to be follow-up action. But I wanted to emphasize to you that when we talk about UN action and our efforts within the multilateral system, we're talking about New York, we're talking about Geneva, we're talking about Rome. For civil aviation, we're talking about Montreal. Environment, we're talking about Nairobi. And for a variety of issues, including nuclear and counter-narcotics and peaceful uses of outer space issues, we're talking about Vienna. So we are on the job working with our partners across these multilateral spaces every day of every week. Now, I want to turn back to New York, though, to talk a little bit about the UN Security Council. Since its earliest days, the Security Council has been criticized as a body that too often is constrained by the diverging interests of its permanent members. And there's some truth there, because as we've seen, we saw Russia's veto on Ukraine 10 days ago. There was a double veto of a resolution on North Korea. The DPRK, Russia and China, came together in that double veto. But we continue to find ways to use the Security Council as it was intended on the full range of peace and security issues. We continue to create and sustain and monitor crucial peacekeeping and peace-building missions at the Security Council. We continue to work for agreement on the targeted use of sanctions to address threats from terrorist organizations, for example. But we are focused on this issue of the veto. And some of you may have noticed the UN General Assembly's April adoption of a resolution co-sponsored by the United States and more than 80 other nations that will automatically convene a debate in the General Assembly whenever a permanent member of the Security Council casts a veto, the so-called Liechtenstein veto resolution. And we're going to see the first session in the General Assembly on this later this week, so stay tuned. Now, we, the U.S., welcomed this resolution as an important step towards placing greater attention on the appropriate use of the veto, and also on the solemn responsibilities of the 5 permanent members. And of course, on the critical role of all members of the Security Council to maintain international peace and security. By abusing the veto, in its vetoes of resolutions on Syria, on the downing of Flight MH17, on the annexation of Crimea, and certainly on Ukraine, Russia has diminished the role and reputation of the Security Council, undermined the UN Charter, and tarnished the UN as a whole. Now, back when the UN was created, when the Security Council was created, nations agreed that there was a need for the Security Council to be the place where issues of peace and security could be addressed, and that we could work together in the Council to try and stop the scourge of war. The Council still has that responsibility, as difficult as some of these sessions may be up in New York. We debate, we condemn, we hold countries accountable, we look for ways to isolate countries that violate the UN Charter, and you have seen us successfully isolate Russia in the General Assembly. The General Assembly's actions over recent months have reinforced international solidarity 3 times to demand an end to the invasion, to insist that humanitarian aid be allowed to reach those in need, and then also the General Assembly, of course, voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. And then the Human Rights Council itself in Geneva created a commission of inquiry to investigate Russia's brutal actions in Ukraine, actions that the U.S. and other nations around the world believe constitute war crimes, holding Russia accountable. So the Russian Federation, I believe, is feeling the isolation. They're feeling the condemnation. And we are going to continue to put the pressure on them until they stop this unjustified war against Ukraine. Now, stepping back a moment, the UN is certainly not perfect, far from it. But we don't have another institution other than the UN to carry out the mandate of international peace and security. In fact, there's no other institution that has the international membership the UN has, as you well know. But of course, and you all are going to be up there again virtually with the Hill tomorrow. While Ukraine remains on the front pages, we cannot and we must not lose sight of the many other conflicts and the many other humanitarian crises in places like Yemen and Syria, South Sudan, Mali, to name just a few. We have got to continue U.S. and multilateral sustained attention to all of these challenges. There are positive opportunities, I believe, to advance peace, to advance cooperation, to advance development, but all of this requires engagement. Engagement on the U.S. part, strategic vision, and thankfully, engagement by you all as well. Now, as you've seen, the Biden-Harris administration has propelled a renewed embrace of multilateral tools, and this is playing out in important ways. We rejoined the Paris Agreement. We've expanded U.S. leadership on climate matters with the guidance of Special Presidential Envoy John Kerry. We've recommitted to the World Health Organization. We're actively engaged in reforming and strengthening WHO's capacity to respond to future pandemic threats and other health emergencies. We have put human rights back at the center of U.S. foreign policy by re-engaging with the UN Human Rights Council, where we assumed an elected seat earlier this year. We are pushing back also against efforts by the People's Republic of China and others who seek to undermine international norms, standards, and institutions. But this type of intensive, sustained diplomacy can make a difference, does make a difference, when nations find common cause, when nations are able to activate a network of international institutions that are there for exactly these purposes. No government can accomplish any of this alone, of course. I want to point out also that the UN itself is an important partner. Of course, the Secretary General, as you may have seen, launched an initiative called Our Common Agenda. And that idea of our common agenda, I think, dovetails very nicely with the summit theme of moving forward together. Our common agenda also builds on the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals and the vision of a greener, safer, better future. It focuses, as do the Sustainable Development Goals, on the importance of gender equity, and I'm looking forward to stepping next door and looking at the photo exhibit with you. In their hands, Women Taking Ownership of Peace, the role of women in peacekeeping. Very, very appropriate focus for us this week. And we are working comprehensively with our partners on all of the above to support all of these: peace and security, global health security, development, SDG, Sustainable Development Goal aspirations. Again, partnerships with UNA, USA, with you all, are crucial to these complex efforts. We need buy-in from all corners of the world, and we need buy-in from people coming from all walks of life. I know we've got some students in the audience today and virtually as well. So for the students out there, we need your energy, we need your optimism, we need your fresh perspectives if we are going to accomplish these shared multilateral goals. I think with you, we will come together and deliver on the success that benefits all Americans. I am sure that you've got many talking points in your hip pocket already for the virtual door knock tomorrow. I'll just add that, U.S. leadership across the multilateral space can and does make a difference to Americans every day. It's not always obvious, but American leadership, U.S. leadership in an organization like the International Civil Aviation Organization up in Montreal means that we achieve consistent, rigorous safety and security standards for commercial air travel. After coming into this job, I think about that every time I head to Dulles or DCA, Reagan National. Our support as the U.S. for UN peacekeeping reduces the chance that regional conflicts will spread, and it also diminishes the likelihood that American armed forces will be put at risk. I'm also focused these days on the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva. There are leadership elections this fall. We have a very strong U.S. candidate, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, running against a Russian candidate, just two candidates at this point in time. But I truly believe that seeing Doreen Bogdan-Martin win this in September is going to help us preserve a multi-stakeholder model and a free and open internet. Incredibly important for all of us. International agreements on limiting greenhouse emission protect Americans from the harmful effects of the climate crisis, effects that impact our health, impact those locations around the world and around our country prone to natural disaster, have an impact on our economy as well. And of course, overarching all of this, we have a shared interest in striving for a world where all people of all nations enjoy human rights and peace and security. History has shown us that suffering and the darkness that comes when these rules are abandoned lead to generations of pain and hardship to the most vulnerable populations around the world. So as our world becomes more complex, more interconnected, as we look to strengthen U.S. leadership across the multilateral system, we continue to make sure that the American people understand that our U.S. national interests, our national security, our national prosperity can be protected, can be advanced by vigorous, active U.S. leadership in these UN and multilateral spaces. And that commitment, of course, has an affirmative agenda, has a positive agenda, because it reflects our national values, values that, of course, are also enshrined in the protection of human rights at the heart of the UN system, values that are under threat right now from a variety of sources, a variety of actors. But as Secretary Blinken noted in his recent remarks at the Asia Society, these are not Western constructs, they are reflections of the world's shared aspirations. So we do see the UN as an indispensable partner in all of this, protecting the multilateral institutions, promoting these values, and these are our U.S. objectives across this multilateral arena. Again, and I'll be up on the Hill in person on Wednesday, so I hope you talk up the audiences on Tuesday. American citizens are safer in a world in which rules are observed. American citizens are safer in a world where prosperity is increasing and where human suffering is alleviated and threats to our collective well-being are contained. So thank you for having me with you today, for your participation in this conversation. I look forward to moving to the chair and taking this to the Q&A session. Thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And I was particularly struck by the importance of the continuing worsening of the food insecurity situation around the world, and the discussion in your conversation, incredibly helpful. You cited 40 million additional people will go into extreme poverty and food insecurity through the rest of the year. So as we think about what issues that we're going to be paying attention to in the summer and the fall, yes, Ukraine will always be there, but I have a feeling that will be paying increased attention to the food insecurity situation and, people starving to death throughout the global south as they deal with the consequences of this chosen war by Putin against the Ukrainian people and the impact on the overall food situation. It's just really frightening.
It is extremely serious. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket.
Yeah.
So the impact on Ukraine's ability to provide food to the rest of the world, not only grain, but also edible oils, has been severely impacted, the impact on the ports. And again, places like Bangladesh, Egypt, Lebanon are really suffering right now because, and many locations in Africa, I heard about this in Mali on my trip out there this spring, are being severely impacted.
Yeah, and we're going to go to questions in a sec. So while we're going to questions, just one last thing, which is, when we think about the Hill message tomorrow, how important is it that we talk about making sure that we meet our financial obligations to the UN? I mean, is that core to what we're trying to communicate, do you think?
It is incredibly important because we cannot do any of this without credibility with our partners. I'll tell you, when we don't pay our bills in full and on time, our adversaries are very quick to use that as a talking point against us, to poke at us with that. It is very clear to me, and I've been on the job just under 6 months, that this comes up not just in the Budget Committee in New York, the 5th Committee, but across the multilateral space. So this is a key point, Peter, of paying our bills in full and on time, not only because it's the right thing to do to make sure that all of our goals and initiatives can move forward, but also we don't want to leave ourselves open to that criticism that only hurts us reputationally.
Thank you. Rachel, I'll have you call on some folks.
Great. So we're going to open the floor for questions. We have mic runners that will come to you. And let's start with you right up here up front with the mic.
Hope it's okay. Hi, my name is Cora. I'm originally from Indiana, but now I live in New York. So you talked about the abuse of the veto power at the Security Council by Russia and also China, but you can't neglect the fact that the United States has also abused the veto power, and this has directly led to exacerbations of conflict situations and deaths of civilians. Also, whenever the veto power was established almost 100 years ago, the situation was very different. There are no states from Africa, South America, Southeast Asia included in the Security Council. In the United States, we would never have 5 people vote and 188 people sit on the sidelines and not have decisions. And you talked about US leadership. But, in the DEI&B space, a lot of this is listening, and the Global South wants to have a voice in these issues. We've seen this come up again and again. So what other changes is the U.S. going to advocate for in reforming the Security Council? Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Cora, for the question. And I do want to make sure that folks are able to track, as I mentioned later this week, the General Assembly will hold this first session under this so-called Liechtenstein initiative. The U.S. is willing, as I think every P5 member should be, to go in and explain if and when it has used its veto, why the particular issues surrounding peace and security compelled the U.S. To cast the vote in that manner. This is, again, is an initiative I think that is incredibly important and was supported, as I said, by over 80 members on member states. On Security Council reform, as you're probably aware, for a number of years, there have been a number of suggestions on different ways to reconfigure or promote reform of the Security Council. These discussions are ongoing. I was DPR, Deputy Perm Rep up in New York. I was the designated participant in a number of these intergovernmental discussions. Those discussions continue. I think, the focus is making sure that we are listening to the voices across the world. And I think the point that you noted, we should be listening. Yes, we should, and we are listening to not only traditional partners, but non-traditional and emerging partners in spaces across the world on the economic, social, and cultural rights that many have raised in the Geneva multilateral spaces, to the climate concerns, and indeed the food security concerns. So I think you've put your finger on it. We must be there, not only engaging and on transmit, we must be listening and taking our partners, both traditional and non-traditionals, views, concerns, priorities into account.
Great, thank you. This is coming from Dr. Eileen Davis-Strom online, and she asked, while helping to restore democracy in Haiti, what can the Security Council do to help stop international organized crime from supporting gangs and gun trafficking? The gangs have outarmed the government. How can civil society help? Thank you.
A question that is an important one, not only because the UN BNU Special Political Mission is on the front burner at the Security Council, but as my bio may have showed, I served as ambassador to Haiti in my last tour, and I left in October of last year. The BNU, UN Special Political Mission, does have a good offices function that enables it to engage not only with the government and law enforcement, but with civil society in Haiti, and that is very important. Of course, our own U.S. Embassy, I hasten to add, putting on the hat I wore last year, is very focused on engaging with civil society, youth, women, educators, but also on those with those groups who are doing community violence reduction and youth empowerment initiatives in some of those very difficult spaces in the urban areas where the gang violence has become such a threat. I think what you'll see both bilaterally and then multilaterally is a continued focus on addressing these police development, community empowerment, civil society building issues. It is, of course, a country that is in our hemisphere and is on the Security Council agenda with the Special Political Mission. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eileen, for asking that question. We'll take another question from our friends in person. Yes, in the back with the microphone.
Hello. My name is Daniel. Wow, loud. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. Actually, I wanted to ask a question about Russia, since you mentioned that Russia's been isolated in the General Assembly and suspended from the Human Rights Council. I wanted to ask if these actions have are there signs that these actions have influenced Russia's policy decision-making and its behavior, and if so, what perhaps are those signs? Thank you.
That's an important question, Daniel. I do believe that the Russian Federation is feeling that pressure, is feeling that isolation. Will that lead to an end of this war in Ukraine sooner rather than later? I have no crystal ball there. We will continue to push, certainly on calling Russia out and, again, holding Russia accountable. That is why the Commission of Inquiry, Independent Commission of Inquiry, in Geneva was created. There are a number of concerns that are also very much on the front burner because we need to work with Russia on the Security Council. You may have noticed that Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, our permanent representative up in New York, was actually on the road last week to the Turkish-Syrian border looking at the Syrian humanitarian needs, because we've also got to renew the Syrian humanitarian resolution in the Security Council this summer. And we're at a critical point in being able to use cross-border, this sole one last remaining cross-border point. So there are ramifications across the space, and I could go on to a number of other critical spaces in which we're going to need to work with all members of the Security Council, including Russia, to push forward on what's right.
Thank you. Next question. Can someone bring the mic to an individual with their hand raised? Yes. And please state your name and where you're from.
It's on? All right. Good evening. I'm Akash Patel, and I'm from Dallas, Texas. I'm a polyglot, and I read that you are also a polyglot. You speak Arabic, French, Haitian Creole, if that's right. So my question relates to the role of language in peacekeeping and national security, and why we as a nation are not doing such a good job with promoting bilingualism or multiculturalism. And I just assumed the role as president of the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. So I'm keen to see how could we help promote the teaching and learning of languages as a part of peacekeeping and national security.
I want to applaud. I, for one, am very glad to learn that you have this role. It is incredibly important because, of course, it's not just about language. It's really understanding through that connection when you are speaking with someone in their own language. There's all the nuances and the enhanced understanding of where your interlocutor is coming from. I think it's incredibly important. We have a terrific Foreign Service Institute, of course, over in Virginia that trains up our Foreign Service staff before they go out, or polishes up a language that they've come into the Foreign Service with. But I think I wish I did have more within my remit to work on some of these issues within our own country. I think it's terrific, and take this message, back to your communities, because it really is at the local level, at the county level, for our public education system to put the focus on early start to foreign language learning. Thank you for that question.
And just in the context of peacekeeping, my cousin's daughter is a peacekeeper in Mali, and she was only deployed there after she had polished up her French, because that was core to her ability to do her job in Timbuktu, was to be able to speak French. So the UN is, of course, committed to making sure that folks are bilingual. And, and one of the things that we saw as well in Mali was the Canadians, who have since withdrawn, but had deployed a helicopter unit, and they were incredibly proud that there was a French-speaking crew from Canada, and this was a great addition that they could make to the peacekeeping mission.
And I think for any of you who are looking, here I'm addressing the students because I do see some faces that may be students out there. If you are looking at the UN Junior Professional Officer, JPO program, or if you're looking at the US Foreign Service exam at some point, focus on these languages. Very important.
Akash, you blew up the chat room with that question. They all agreed with you. Okay, we'll take another question in the audience, and if you can pass the mic to the person that wants to speak.
Hi, I'm Luke Clausen. I'm from the Iowa chapter. I work with former Ambassador to China, Terry Branstad. And so my question relates to China and Secretary Blinken's speech on our China strategies, Invest, Align, Compete. But in the UN, we have to cooperate with China, whether we like it or not. And so how's the State Department and America working with, or what areas are they cooperating with China on within the UN? What are those areas of cooperation is basically my question.
Now, thanks for that question. Well, of course, China is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So every single item on that agenda of the Security Council, every peacekeeping mission, every special political mission, every debate, every closed door or open session, we are working with China. But of course, it goes bigger. We're working with China in the UN spaces around the world. China is actually a member of the Human Rights Council. All P5 members are members of the Human Rights Council in this particular incarnation. That's not always been the case. But I want to go back to, yes, invest, align, compete. Absolutely. In the multilateral space, we see both China and Russia working to drive an alternative authoritarian agenda at the UN. We see China and Russia both putting significant resources, significant personnel behind their goals. So we do need to focus on showing the world, showing the American people, but showing the world that democracies can deliver. I mentioned the JPO, Junior Professional Officer Program, a moment ago. So we sort of call this topic back in our IO Bureau, multilateral strategic competition. So one of the ways that we engage in this multilateral strategic competition is promoting the best U.S. and the best like-minded partner candidates for positions within the UN system, for election to senior positions within UN agencies, funds, and programs. But also, we are working to increase the number of junior professional officers in the UN system from the United States. These are young professional limited term appointments. There's no guarantee of a follow-on long-term employment by the UN, but about 50% of them do go on. And it's one way in this strategic competition that we see many other countries, including China, having put resources in for an extended number of years, where we're now putting more resources in, so that folks are serving at the UN Secretariat in New York, at IAEA in Vienna, at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, really across the UN space. So this multilateral strategic competition, of course, is about making sure that our values are lifted up in joint statements and UN resolutions, that the latest language from China's Global Security Initiative or Global Development Initiative isn't cut and pasted into a UN document without folks understanding what this means, but also making sure that we're on the top of our game in making sure that we have well-qualified Americans and like-minded coming into the UN, whether it's through the junior professional officer program at the mid-level or into these senior UN appointments.
Great. The other thing I might add is interns.
Yes.
Please, there's lots of internships in the UN system, not only in New York, but around the world, so please apply. Americans are underrepresented in internships.
So I'm going to do like a public service announcement here, because we really have upgraded the portal and the interface at our State Department website for folks interested in, Americans interested in internships, JPO, or any aspect of working with the UN. And not only an interactive portal, we've got a great team that's been stood up, and I will thank Congress when I'm up there. I will thank the Hill when I'm up there on Wednesday, because we have had increased amount of resources dedicated, thanks to the Hill, to be able to devote to this. But check it out if you're interested.
Awesome. One last question.
Yes, the lady of the checkered jacket, if you could pass her the mic. Thank you.
Being here. Hello.
It's on now.
My name is Alimata Kulibali, and thank you for all these great messages. So I just learned that you came from Mali, where I'm originally from, and Tombouctou is where my mom is from. So basically, I know also back in January, Ambassador Linda Greenfield went to Mali and also other countries, and you also came from there. So basically, what the US is planning to do about the situation of Mali, because since a decade ago, so we've been in political and economical instability, and with the jihadist group, Islamic jihadist group, and now with the different coups that the Mali had for the last few past years. The ECOWAS decided to put an embargo for several months now. Everybody is suffering in Mali. So beside all that, and I know that Russian is very unpopular right now globally, but Russia was the only country with China to give hand to Mali and support them. So what the US is about to do in this situation?
Thank you. That's a big question to end with, but we'll go with it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Alimata. And it is a complicated situation in Mali. I'm going to take the multilateral piece because that is what I am responsible for as the Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs. But of course, we are coordinating very closely with our U.S. interagency on the U.S. Bilateral policy as well. The UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, has an important mandate, and that mandate needs to be renewed by the end of this month, of June. That mandate is to further political stability, further the Algiers Accord. That's a very important piece of it. It's also got a very big mandate on protection of civilians and human rights reporting. It's got a complicated situation right now because we've seen the Kremlin-backed Wagner mercenary group come in to Mali, spread disinformation as they have in other countries on the continent and in other places in the world that really has made it very difficult for the MINUSMA peacekeepers to carry out their mandate in parts of the country. And that means they can't carry out that protection of civilians mandate. That is very, very troubling. The mission there has not been able to access at times some of the sites where human rights abuses have been alleged to have occurred. That is not acceptable. Because that is what the Security Council has sent the peacekeepers there to do. And I'm going to just underscore the importance of the Security Council coming together this month of June to be able to enable MINUSMA to carry out these especially important protection of civilian, promoting political dialogue and human rights protection imperatives.
Great. Well, you have covered everything from Security Council reform to Mali to the importance of foreign languages and the importance of Americans participating at all levels of the UN. And as always, you have covered the waterfront of multilateral issues so expertly and wonderfully with us today. Deeply appreciative of the fact that you took time out of your busy schedule to join us, to participate in this, particularly when you're getting ready for your Hill testimony on Wednesday. So I hope all of you will join me in thanking Ambassador Michelle Cecile.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Now, Rachel, you have an announcement.
Yes, thank you once again. We really appreciate you being with us here today. And the day is not over, everyone. I'm excited to invite you to next door, behind that big blue curtain. We have a great reception featuring a photo exhibition, which is in partnership with UN Peacekeeping and UN Women. So please join us. And I just hope you had a really good day with all the different sessions and are ready to advocate for strong U.S. leadership at the UN and full U.S. funding for the UN. So go UNA USA. Thank you.